The smell of death lingered in every corner of the house, settling into the old wood like a permanent stain. Eleanor had noticed it the moment she crossed the threshold. That peculiar mixture of old roses, decay, and secrets buried so deep they'd fossilized into the very foundation. At 28 years old, a widow for only 7 months, she now stood in this sprawling Victorian mansion, inheritance papers still warm in her hands, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Arabella Ashford, a name that meant nothing to her, a distant cousin she'd never met, someone who'd slipped through the cracks of family trees and forgotten genealogies. But the lawyers were adamant. Eleanor was the sole heir. The house, the land, the contents, all hers now. When they'd read the amount of debt the estate carried, Eleanor almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she'd quit her job at the insurance firm, packed what little she owned, and drove through rain so heavy it seemed the sky was weeping for her. She'd needed this. Needed to disappear into something, anything, that wasn't the apartment where Thomas had died. Not died, that was too gentle a word. Where Thomas had ended. Overdose. Accidental, they said. Eleanor knew better. She knew that his addiction, his despair, his inability to be loved by someone as broken as she was, those had been the real killers. Now, standing in the foyer of Ashford House, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing, not yet, but perhaps a beginning. The house exhaled around her. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, filtering through windows so filthy they looked frosted. Furniture lurked beneath white sheets like ghosts waiting to be unveiled. A grand staircase curved upward into shadow. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors stared down with eyes that seemed to follow her as she moved through the space. She'd decided immediately to clear everything out. An auctioneer was coming next week, along with representatives from various charities. The house would be emptied, cleaned, sold. Eleanor would take the money, however little there might be after debts, and start fresh somewhere warm. Somewhere that didn't smell like the past. But on her second morning, as she began removing sheet covers and cataloging furniture, she found the first note. It was in the east wall of the parlor, hidden in a crack so thin she almost missed it. Eleanor had been examining the fireplace, noting the damage to the mantelpiece, when her eye caught the glimmer of yellowed paper. She worked her fingers into the gap, careful not to cut herself on the jagged plaster edge. The paper was brittle, ancient, covered in careful handwriting that spoke of someone trying very hard not to tremble as they wrote. If you find this, then I have escaped. Then I am alive. Then I am free. But freedom is not an end. It is only a beginning. Listen to the walls. Every crack, every shadow, every whisper holds a piece of the truth. Find all of my messages. Piece together what happened here. Understand what we suffered. But be warned, some truths demand a price. Some secrets are hungry. There was no signature, no date. Only those words, and beneath them, scratched into the corner of the page as if added in haste. They cannot silence us forever. Eleanor's hands had gone cold. She sat down on a dusty settee, the note trembling between her fingers. The handwriting was feminine, young perhaps, desperate. She read the words again and again, searching for meaning, for context, for anything that would explain why someone had been writing cryptic warnings and hiding them inside walls. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in the master bedroom, a room that still smelled of lavender sachets and old perfume, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the wind moved through the house's corridors like a living thing, sighing through the rafters, pressing against the windows, and underneath that sound, something else. Something that might have been the settling of old wood, or might have been something far stranger. Around 3 a.m, she got up and began searching. She moved systematically through the ground floor, running her hands along every wall, tapping plaster, listening for hollow spaces. In the library, a room so packed with books it felt like the volumes themselves were holding the structure together, she found the second crack. This one was wider, more deliberate. Someone had clearly widened it at some point, creating a pocket just large enough to slip papers inside. 3 notes this time. 3 different handwritings. 3 different voices, calling out from the past. The first, October 1947. My sister is gone. Murdered. That is the word I use in my mind, though no one will speak it aloud. They say she fell down the stairs. They say it was an accident, but I heard him shouting. I heard her screaming. I heard the sound of her body tumbling and then silence. Terrible, absolute silence. Mother acts as if the grief is manageable, something one endures like bad weather. Father sits in his study as if she never existed. And I must remain silent, because to speak is to accuse, and to accuse is to betray the family name. The 2nd, June 1952. We are not women here. We are possessions. Walking, talking possessions that must dress correctly, speak softly, think what we are told to think. Margaret tried to leave last week. They found her at the train station and brought her back. Now she stays in her room. They say she is ill. I know what she really is. She is a woman who wanted freedom, and this house is the prison they built to keep her. The 3rd, December 1956. The walls are listening. I have begun to believe this is true. Not metaphorically. Actually, the house itself knows our secrets. It remembers every whispered prayer, every stifled sob, every thought of escape. And somehow it is keeping score. Eleanor read them 3 times before setting them down, her mind reeling. This was not just one woman writing these notes. This was a chronicle, a history. Multiple women, spanning years, all trapped in this house, all leaving pieces of themselves behind in the walls like breadcrumbs for someone, anyone, to find. She searched the rest of the night and into the morning. By the time the sun rose, she'd found 17 more notes, scattered throughout the house in cracks that seemed to grow more obvious the more she looked for them. Under the floorboards in the bathroom, behind the loose brick in the kitchen fireplace, tucked into the narrow space between the attic door frame and the wall. Each note was a fragment of a different woman's story. Each one a voice from the past, crying out across decades. 1963. They locked me in the cellar today because I laughed too loudly at dinner. Laughter is defiance, Father says. Defiance must be punished. I don't know how long I was down there. The darkness took time away from me. I found a brick loose on the wall and hid this note inside it, not knowing if anyone would ever find it, but needing to know that someone might, that my suffering might not be entirely invisible. 1968. I have decided to kill myself, or perhaps I have already decided this, and now I am simply waiting for the decision to fully form, to become solid enough to act upon. Mother has pills in her nightstand. I counted them. There are enough. Perhaps enough for 2. 1971. I am not who they say I am. In this house, I am a daughter, a sister, a woman to be married off to some suitable man who will own me the way Father owns Mother. But in my mind, in my secret heart, I am someone else entirely. I am a person. I am real. And somewhere in this house, I am leaving proof of my reality. These notes, this voice, this small rebellion. By afternoon, Eleanor had covered the parlor floor with papers. 17 notes arranged chronologically, each one a piece of a puzzle she didn't yet understand. The handwriting varied. Some notes were careful and controlled, others frantic and barely legible. Some were written in what looked like charcoal or graphite. One was written in what might have been blood, though Eleanor tried not to think about that too carefully. The pattern was undeniable. Women. Multiple women. Over decades, all trapped in this house, all suffering in ways that words barely captured. All reaching out across time, hoping someone would listen. But the most disturbing part was this. In almost every note, there was a reference to the walls themselves, as if the walls were not just a prison, but something more, something conscious, something that remembered. The walls know. The walls have always known, and soon they will speak. This phrase appeared in 4 different notes, written in 4 different hands, across nearly 20 years of separation. The walls will speak. Eleanor packed her things that night. She told herself she was leaving, that she was done with this house and its creeping horror. She called the auctioneer and told him to cancel. She threw the notes into her car and she drove, but she didn't get far. About 5 miles from the house on a dark stretch of country road, her car's engine died. Just stopped, mid-acceleration, as if someone had flipped a switch. Eleanor coasted to the shoulder, heart hammering, and tried the ignition again. Nothing. No sound at all. Not even the whine of a starter motor. She sat there for 20 minutes before she realized she was being foolish. The notes were in her car. If she left the car, she left the notes. And the notes were the only proof that something was wrong in that house, that something had been wrong for a very long time. So she called a tow truck. And when the driver arrived, a man with kind eyes and a face weathered by years on the road, he took one look at her engine and said, Timing belt. Completely severed. Looks like something ate right through it. Strangest thing I ever seen. Something had eaten through the timing belt. Eleanor nodded, said nothing, and asked him to tow her back to the house. You sure? The driver asked. Awful place. A lot of folks around here got stories about that old Ashford house. Stories? Eleanor's mouth had gone dry. The driver shrugged. Nothing concrete, just stories. People disappearing, strange lights in the windows at night. Used to be every so often, a woman from town would go up there. Usually some poor girl the family figured they could control. And she'd come back, different, or not come back at all. It was a long time ago, though. Probably just legends. Eleanor climbed back into the tow truck without responding. As they drove back toward the house, she watched the landscape change from road to trees, from civilization to isolation. The house emerged from the twilight like a ship from fog, massive, gothic, patient. The windows were dark except for one, on the third floor, where a single light burned. Eleanor hadn't turned any lights on that floor. She'd intended to pack properly, to take what she needed and leave everything else behind. But when she entered the house, something shifted. The air felt different, thicker somehow, charged with intention. The dust motes that had floated aimlessly that morning now seemed to move with purpose, swirling in patterns that resembled symbols. The note she'd found first was on the kitchen table, though she'd left it in the parlor. Beside it lay a new note, the ink still wet. You came back? Good. You were meant to find us. You were meant to understand. But understanding requires investment, sacrifice. Are you willing to pay the price? No, Eleanor whispered to the empty kitchen. I'm not. But even as she said it, she knew she was lying. Because despite the fear, despite the wrongness of it all, she was curious. More than curious. She was hungry for the truth the way a starving person hungers for food. Over the next week, Eleanor stopped pretending she was going to leave. She gave the auctioneer a false date for the sale. She called the furniture dealers and told them the job had been postponed. She told herself she would stay just long enough to understand. Just long enough to piece together what had happened in this house. The notes continued to appear. She found them in new locations, tucked into the spine of books, rolled up inside empty picture frames, sealed inside mason jars and hidden in the pantry behind dormant jars of preserves that might have been 50 years old. Each note was a window into a different woman's experience, a different era of the house's dark history. 1944, the war is ending, and with it, perhaps my hope of escape. I had thought that with so many men away, there might be opportunities. But there are none. Father has ensured that we remain here, that we remain isolated. The wireless is his only, and he controls what we hear. Mother has not left the house in 6 years. I think she has forgotten what the outside world looks like. 1959. Charlotte is pregnant. She will not say who the father is. Father beats her, screaming at her to confess. But she refuses. There is something in her silence that terrifies me more than his anger. I think she has made a choice. A terrible choice, but a choice nonetheless. And that terrifies him more than anything. 1974. I have found the photographs, hidden in a box beneath the floorboards in Father's study. Photographs of us, of me, of my sisters. The things he has done, the way he has documented them. I cannot write more. I cannot speak of it. But I have hidden these photographs within these walls as evidence, as proof. If anyone finds them, if anyone ever comes here, they will know the truth. They will know what happened here. They will know what he did. Eleanor's hands shook as she read this final note. She went directly to the study, a room she'd avoided until now, and began systematically removing floorboards. It took her 3 hours, but she found it. A wooden box, sealed with wax, containing photographs that described horrors she'd never wanted to know existed. She burned them. Even though she understood their value as evidence, she couldn't bear to look at them any longer. She took them to the fireplace in the parlor and watched them curl and blacken, and she wept. That night, Eleanor heard footsteps in the hall outside her bedroom. She opened the door to find the corridor empty, lit by moonlight from the windows at either end. But there was a sound, a soft scraping, like fingernails on wood coming from inside the walls themselves. "Who are you?" Eleanor called out, her voice small in the vast house. The scraping stopped. Silence fell, so complete that Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat. And then, from within the walls, a voice. Not a physical voice, but something that manifested directly in her mind. bypassing her ears entirely. We are the ones who stayed, the ones who could not escape, the ones the walls would not release. Eleanor staggered backward, gripping the doorframe. This isn't real. I'm tired. I'm imagining. You found our messages. You read our words. You burned our photographs. You are real enough. We are real enough. The question is, will you help us finish what we started? Finish what? Eleanor's voice cracked. Release us. Set us free. The walls are hungry, Eleanor. They have been feeding on our anguish for so long. But there is a way to sate them. There is a ritual. And there is a reason you were brought here. You are the key. Eleanor slammed the door and locked it. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, listening to the sounds the house made. The creaking of wood, the settling of ancient stone, the whisper of wind through cracks and crevices. And underneath it all, that other sound. The sound of breathing. The sound of the house itself, alive and waiting. By morning, she'd made a decision. She would go to the library, the largest room in the house, filled with books that no one had read in decades. Perhaps there was a history. Perhaps there was a record of the Ashford family that would explain what had happened here. The library was on the second floor, occupying the entire eastern wing. Eleanor had barely entered it before. The smell of aging paper and leather was almost suffocating. The books rose from floor to ceiling in mahogany shelves, and a sliding ladder on brass rails ran the length of the room. In the center stood a large oak desk, covered in writing supplies that looked like they hadn't been used since the 1950s. She started with the desk. In the drawers, she found journals, a dozen of them, bound in leather, filled with handwriting she recognized from the hidden notes. But this handwriting was different. These journals were organized, structured, meant to be read in sequence. These were confessions. The first journal began in 1943. I'm starting this record so that, should anything happen to me, there will be proof of what occurs in this house. My name is Catherine Ashford. I am 17 years old. I have lived in this house my entire life, and I have never left its grounds except under supervision. Today my father told me I will never leave. He said it plainly, as if stating a fact about the weather. You will remain here, he said. This is your purpose. This is your duty. I asked to whom or what I owed such a duty. He struck me. Later, Mother came to my room and applied salve to my cheek. She did not speak. There was nothing to say. She has never left this house either. Neither has my sister Margaret. Neither has Eleanor, my sister, not I. We are prisoners. Though the bars are made of wood and stone rather than iron. Eleanor read on, watching as Catherine's handwriting grew less careful, more frantic, more desperate. Journal after journal, entry after entry, a timeline of imprisonment and abuse and slow psychological deterioration. By the third journal, Catherine had begun to do something extraordinary. She had started documenting not just her own experiences, but those of the other women in the house. Her sisters, her mother, the servants who came and went. She wrote about the rules that governed their lives. Rules so arbitrary and cruel they seemed designed specifically to break the human spirit. No laughter above a whisper. No books without fathers. Approval. No discussing matters outside the house. No contact with the outside world. No thoughts that might constitute rebellion. And more, page after page, a catalog of restrictions so comprehensive that freedom itself became an abstract concept. Something that existed in other people's lives, but not in this house. In the fourth journal, Eleanor found the turning point. The moment when Catherine's careful documentation shifted into something else. Something dangerous. I have discovered something remarkable and terrible. The house itself is aware. I do not mean this metaphorically. I mean it literally. The walls have consciousness. They remember everything that happens within them. They hold the echo of our suffering. And tonight I felt them speak to me. Not in words, but in sensations. I understood finally what has been happening all along. Every woman who has lived in this house, every moment of despair and helplessness, has been absorbed into the structure itself, and the house has grown fat on it, bloated with our pain. But it can offer something in return. Power, knowledge, the ability to reverse what has been done to us. The remaining pages of that journal were mostly blank, except for a single sentence written repeatedly, filling page after page in increasingly frantic handwriting. It offered me a choice. It offered me a choice. It offered me a choice. Eleanor set the journal down, her heart racing. She searched for the fifth journal, assuming there must be more, but found only these four. The last entry was dated June 15th, 1977. After that date, nothing. No more journals. No more record of Catherine's life. But tucked into the back of the final journal was a small photograph. Eleanor pulled it out and gasped. It was a picture of 4 women, taken sometime in the 1970s, standing in front of the house. They all looked pale, worn down, as if they'd been left in the sun too long and had faded. But their eyes were striking. They glowed with an intensity that seemed almost otherworldly. And one of them, the youngest, had Eleanor's face. Not exactly her face, but close enough that Eleanor could see the family resemblance. Close enough that it was undeniable. This was a blood relative, perhaps a great aunt, perhaps something more. Eleanor searched for more photographs but found none. She did, however, find something else, a genealogy, meticulously maintained in a leather-bound ledger that tracked the Ashford family back to the early 1800s. And beside each name was a date, a birth date, and for many of them, a death date. And beside the death dates, a location. Most of the women in the family had died in the house. Born in the house, raised in the house, died in the house. Some at advanced ages, some far too young. One entry, for a girl named Margaret, listed no death date at all, only a single word: disappeared. Eleanor's hands trembled as she looked at the genealogy. She traced the lines with her finger, following the branches like a maze that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. And then she came to a blank entry at the end. The final line: space for a new name. Space for Eleanor. No, she whispered, but even as she said it, she felt the house settle around her, as if pleased, as if her denial was exactly what it had been waiting to hear. Over the next 3 days, Eleanor stopped leaving her room except to eat and use the facilities. She lay in bed and listened to the sounds of the house. The sounds changed now. They were more insistent, more purposeful. At night she could hear them clearly. Whispers from within the walls, footsteps in the corridors, the sound of a woman crying somewhere far away, the sound of a piano playing, though the piano in the parlor hadn't been tuned in decades and certainly couldn't play on its own. On the 4th day, Eleanor found a note on her pillow. She hadn't left it there. She was certain of it. And yet there it was, a single sheet of paper addressed to her. "We are not asking any more, Eleanor. We are telling. You must complete the ritual. You must speak our names. You must speak the truth of what happened here. You must bear witness to our suffering and, in doing so, release us. If you do not do this, you will remain here as we have remained. The house will keep you. The walls will keep you. And one day another woman like you will arrive, confused and grieving, and you will become part of our chorus. You will spend your death crying from within the plaster and stone, unless you act now." Eleanor had cracked. She went to the parlor, where the original notes had accumulated into a small pile on the mantelpiece. She read through them all again, each one a voice, each one a call for help. And she made a decision. She would speak their names. She would tell their stories. She would be their witness, even if no one else was listening, even if the only witness to history was the house itself. She began in the parlor with the first note. She read it aloud, her voice steady and clear, and she spoke the name Catherine. She told Catherine's story, her imprisonment, her slow descent into desperation, her discovery that the house itself was conscious. Then she moved through the library, reading each journal entry aloud, speaking the names of Catherine's sisters, speaking the name of Catherine's mother, speaking the names of servants and guests and family friends who had passed through the house and either been corrupted by it or driven away by it. She spoke the name Margaret, who had disappeared in 1956. She spoke the name Eleanor, her great-aunt, whose fate remained unrecorded but whose life was surely preserved somewhere within these walls. She spoke for hours, her voice growing hoarse, until she had spoken every name she could find, every story that had been preserved in the notes and journals and hidden photographs. And as she spoke, the house seemed to listen. The air grew quieter. The walls stopped their scraping and sighing. The sense of presence that had pervaded the rooms began to lift. By evening, Eleanor felt something change. It was subtle at first, a lightening of the atmosphere, a sense that something heavy had been released. She went to the window and looked out at the grounds, now bathed in sunset light. And there, moving among the gardens, she saw them. Translucent figures, barely visible but unmistakably present. Women. All of them. Catherine and her sisters, and their mother, and the others whose names she'd found in the journals. They moved through the garden like spirits who'd suddenly remembered they could feel the wind, like prisoners stepping out of their cells for the first time. And at the center of this gathering of spectral figures stood Catherine, looking directly at Eleanor. She raised one hand in what might have been gratitude or might have been goodbye. And then all of them began to fade, not in agony, but in peace. One by one, they became less substantial, less real, until they faded into the gathering dark and were gone. Eleanor stood at the window for a long time after they disappeared. The house around her felt different now, emptier, but in a good way. The oppressive weight was gone. The sense of awareness had withdrawn. It was just a house again, just old wood and stone and plaster, nothing more. But Eleanor couldn't stay in it, not anymore. She packed her things, gathered all the journals and notes and documentation, and locked the door behind her as she left. The car started immediately, as if the mechanical failure had been a dream. Eleanor drove through the night, away from the house, away from the valley, into whatever future might be waiting for her. She told herself she would destroy the journals. She would burn the notes. She would forget everything that had happened. But she never did. Instead, Eleanor drove for 2 weeks, stopping in small towns she'd never heard of, sleeping in cheap motels, trying to process what she'd experienced. And gradually, as the miles accumulated behind her, she became aware of something strange. The story was changing. The details of her experience were becoming distorted, as if they were being filtered through water. The names began to blur. The faces became indistinct. The timeline of events began to shift and rearrange itself. By the time she reached a small town in Vermont, Eleanor realized what was happening. The house had done something to her, or perhaps she had done it to herself. Either way, she was beginning to forget the specific details, while the emotional weight of the experience, the horror, the grief, the desperate need to bear witness, remained crystal clear. She checked into a hotel and spread all the documents on the floor of her room. Photographs, journals, notes, genealogies. She read through them all again, trying to burn the details into her memory, but it was like trying to hold water in her hands. The specific facts kept slipping away even as she read them. Eleanor understood then that she had been changed by the house. Changed into a messenger, a carrier of the story. And the story itself was more important than any specific detail. She made a decision. She would write it all down. She would create her own journal, her own record, so that even if she forgot, there would be proof. There would be documentation. She spent a week in that Vermont hotel, writing feverishly, translating everything she could remember from the old journals into a new narrative. She changed some names, not to conceal anything, but because she genuinely couldn't remember the originals. She adjusted timelines that had become fuzzy. She synthesized conversations that she could no longer quite recall verbatim. And when she was done, she had created a new version of the story. It was slightly different from the original. The details had shifted, but the truth remained intact. Eleanor then did something she couldn't quite explain. She searched for another house, one that felt empty, abandoned, forgotten. It took her a month of driving, but she found it. An old colonial mansion in Connecticut, long abandoned, its owners dead or moved away. She broke in through a basement window and made her way to the attic. There, in the darkness, Eleanor hid her journal. She found a loose board in the attic floor and placed the journal in the cavity beneath, covering it carefully so that it would be found only if someone was searching for it. Only if someone was meant to find it. Then she left, and she didn't look back. Over the following months, Eleanor tried to build a normal life. She found work at a library in Boston, a position that felt right, somehow, like she was meant to be among books and stories. She rented an apartment. She made friends. She even eventually began to date again. The grief that had defined her, the loss of Thomas, the loss of her marriage, the loss of her sense of self, began to fade into something more manageable. Something that could coexist with joy and hope and the possibility of a future. But sometimes, late at night, Eleanor would remember fragments of her time in the house. A phrase from one of the journals would surface unexpectedly. A name would materialize in her mind, and she would feel the presence of those women, Catherine and her sisters and all the others, watching her, waiting, patient. Waiting for what, Eleanor didn't know. But she suspected she would find out eventually. 5 years after she'd left the Ashford house, Eleanor received a phone call. It was from a real estate agent in the town where the house stood. The property was being cleared for development. The house was being demolished. And before that happened, they were selling off its contents. "We found something odd," the agent said.
In the walls.
Dozens of notes sealed in metal boxes. Love letters, I suppose. Some kind of correspondence. "We wondered if you, as the former owner, might have some insight into what they are." Eleanor's heart had stopped. The notes. Somehow more notes had been found. Notes she hadn't seen. Notes that had been hidden in the walls all along, waiting for discovery. "I'll come back," Eleanor heard herself say. "I'll help you sort through them." She made the drive back to the Ashford house in less than 6 hours. When she arrived, the place looked different, shabby and small compared to her memory of it. The real estate agent, a young man named David, showed her into the parlor where hundreds of notes had been carefully arranged on tables. Eleanor's hands trembled as she picked them up. These weren't from Catherine's era. These were from later, from the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s. The handwriting was different, but the desperation was the same. Women, trapped in this house, reaching out across time, leaving messages in the walls. And then Eleanor found a note that made her blood turn to ice. It was in a handwriting she recognized. It was in her own handwriting. "If you find this, then it has begun again. If you find this, then the house has already chosen a new keeper, a new witness. Someone like me. Someone lost. Someone grieving. Someone perfect. The walls are patient, they wait. And when they find someone who is broken enough, hurting enough, desperate enough, they reach out. They offer shelter, and what begins as shelter becomes prison. And what begins as prison becomes something else entirely." Below that entry, in a different hand, someone had written, "She's right. It has begun. I arrived 3 weeks ago thinking I'd inherited a house. Now I understand that the house has inherited me, and I can feel others in the walls. I can feel them watching. They're waiting for me to understand. They're waiting for me to speak their names. And soon I know I will have no choice." Eleanor staggered backward. She looked at the real estate agent. "How many of these notes are there?" "Hundreds," David said. "We found them in nearly every wall. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen. It's like different women were running some kind of chain letter across decades, each one leaving messages for the next one." Eleanor understood then. The cycle hadn't ended. It had merely paused. Catherine and the others had been released, yes. But the house itself, the house remained. And the house was still hungry. She gathered all the notes she could carry and left the house without another word. As she drove away, she saw in her rearview mirror smoke rising from the structure. The demolition crew was starting their work. The house was being torn down, reduced to rubble and memory. But Eleanor knew better. She knew that the house, the real house, the conscious and terrible house, would simply wait for a new structure to be built. Or it would move to a different building. Or it would exist in the spaces between moments, patient and eternal, waiting for the next broken woman to arrive looking for salvation. She drove back to Boston and returned to her job at the library. She began researching houses with histories of female disappearances. She found dozens, hundreds, all across America. Old buildings with stories, with women who had vanished, with rooms that seemed to absorb suffering the way earth absorbs rain. And Eleanor began to realize what her true purpose was. She wasn't meant to stop the cycle. She was meant to bear witness to it, to preserve the stories, to ensure that the voices of the women trapped in those walls were not forgotten. She started writing. She published stories and essays, always slightly fictionalized, always protecting the guilty because the guilty were too vast and too systemic to protect against. She wrote about women trapped in structures, both literal and metaphorical. She wrote about the ways that isolation and control could corrode the human spirit. She wrote about the hunger of the past and the way it reached forward, desperate to be acknowledged, and readers began to contact her, telling her their own stories. Their mothers who had been trapped, their grandmothers who had disappeared, their great-aunts whose fates remained unknown. Eleanor collected these stories. She added them to her archive. She built a vast library of testimony, of women's voices crying out across time. Years passed. Eleanor grew older. Her hair grayed. Her face lined. The fresh wounds of her grief over Thomas became scars, still visible but no longer bleeding. She had lovers, briefly. She had friends. She had a life that, from the outside, looked reasonably normal and reasonably happy. But always in the background, there were the stories. The voices. The weight of all those women pressing against the walls that separated the dead from the living. Eleanor was 62 years old when she received the inheritance notice. She actually laughed when she read it. It was from a lawyer representing the estate of an unknown woman named Sarah Chen. Sarah had died and left her property to Eleanor Hartwell, the writer. Due to the nature of your published works, the letter explained, Ms. Chen was inspired to leave her estate to you. She felt you would understand its significance better than anyone else. The property was in Massachusetts. Another old house. Eleanor seriously considered throwing the letter away and never responding. But she couldn't. Some part of her, the part that had been shaped and hardened by her experience in the Ashford house, knew that she had to go. Not because she wanted to, but because she was being called. And she had learned long ago that when the house called, there was no use in resisting. The property was a federal-style mansion in Salem, Massachusetts. Built in 1812, it had survived countless fires, wars, and renovations. It sat on a hill overlooking the town, isolated by woods on three sides. When Eleanor arrived, the lawyer, a woman named Patricia Morrison who seemed unusually nervous about handing over the keys, tried to brief her on the property's condition. It's been closed up for several years, Patricia said. Ms. Chen lived here alone after her husband's death. She was quite reclusive, didn't maintain it well. There's water damage, structural issues, and... Patricia hesitated. There have been reports from neighbors about unusual sounds. Voices, mostly, crying. But I'm sure that's just the house settling or animals or... It's neither, Eleanor said quietly. Thank you. I'll take it from here. Patricia looked relieved to leave. Eleanor stood in the foyer of yet another old house in yet another town and felt the now familiar sensation of being watched, of being known, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The house was not in terrible condition, as she'd expected. In fact, it seemed almost pristine in some rooms, while other spaces had fallen into complete disrepair. There was a logic to it, Eleanor realized. The house had maintained the areas it wanted to preserve. The areas that mattered. She began her search in the master bedroom, and within an hour she found the first note, hidden in the window seat. My name is Sarah Chen. I came to this house as a bride, full of hope and anticipation. I left my family's home in San Francisco to be with a man I loved. He promised me freedom. He promised me a life full of possibility. Instead, he brought me here, to this house, where possibility died the moment the door closed behind me. That was 43 years ago. I am still here. I do not know if I will ever leave. Eleanor sat down heavily on the bed. 43 years. One woman alone in this house for 4 decades. She imagined the slow erosion of hope, the gradual transformation of a woman into something less than human, a ghost perhaps, haunting her own life. She spent the night reading Sarah Chen's journals. They were organized chronologically, starting from 1982, the year Sarah had arrived at the house as a newlywed. Year after year, Sarah documented her marriage, her imprisonment, her slow realization that she would never escape. The violence wasn't physical, not always. It was subtler than that. Her husband had isolated her, told her that her family didn't love her, that her friends were frauds, that the world outside was dangerous and cruel. He had convinced her that the house was her only safe place. And eventually Sarah had believed him. But unlike Catherine Ashford, Sarah had not had the comfort of knowing she wasn't alone. She had shared the house with only her husband, a man who grew crueler and more controlling with each passing year. She had no sisters, no mother, no other women to commiserate with. She had only the walls, and gradually, over decades, she had learned to communicate with them. The later journals were filled with descriptions of conversations Sarah had with the house itself. She described it almost as though it had become her only friend, her only confidant. And the house, in turn, had begun to keep her. When her husband would go out, the doors would sometimes lock behind him, trapping him outside for hours. When he tried to drive away, the car would mysteriously fail to start. When he attempted to hurt Sarah, objects in the house would move on their own, creating barriers between them. The house, Eleanor realized, had made a choice. It had kept Sarah prisoner, yes, but it had also protected her from worse fates. And in the end, it had become something like a companion to her. The final journal entry was dated just 6 weeks ago. My husband died today. Heart attack. I stood in the room and watched it happen, and I felt nothing. Perhaps the house has taken that from me too, the capacity to feel grief. Or perhaps I simply have no grief left. I have spent my life here. I have aged here. I have become part of this structure, and it has become part of me. I am 91 years old. I do not expect to live much longer. When I die, I will become another voice in the walls, another echo, another presence haunting the space between the living and the dead. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Perhaps that is the price we all must pay. We broken women, we prisoners, we believers in love that did not save us. We become the walls. We become the house. We become the story that is told to the next woman who arrives, looking for shelter. Below that entry, in a different handwriting, shaky and uncertain, Sarah had written one final line. I could not find the courage to leave, but I have left the house to someone who can. Someone who will understand. Someone like me. Someone like us. Eleanor Hartwell, I am leaving you my inheritance. Not the money, there is little of that, but the house, the knowing, the burden of witness. I hope you will forgive me for adding to your weight. But I could not leave it empty. Eleanor closed the journal and wept. Not for Sarah. Sarah had, in her own way, found peace. But for all of them. For Catherine and her sisters. For the servants and the daughters and the wives who had been swallowed by these structures. For all the women whose names had been forgotten, whose stories had been lost, whose suffering had been absorbed into wood and stone and plaster. That night, Eleanor heard her again. Not in words, but in sensations. Sarah's presence, moving through the house like a ghost reviewing its own history. Eleanor didn't resist. She spoke to Sarah aloud, telling her that her story would be preserved, that her suffering would not be forgotten, that her voice, though silenced in life, would echo across generations. And in the morning, Eleanor felt a shift. The oppressive weight that had characterized the house when she arrived had lifted. The structure felt lighter, less hungry. Sarah had been waiting for permission to let go, permission to stop fighting, permission to simply fade away. Eleanor spent 3 weeks documenting everything in the house. She photographed every space, every surface. She transcribed all of Sarah's journals by hand, preserving them in a new format that would be harder to lose or destroy. She searched the walls carefully, finding more notes, some from Sarah, some from earlier inhabitants, some from people whose identities had been lost to time. And then she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of leaving the house, Eleanor decided to stay. Not permanently. She still maintained her apartment in Boston, her job at the library, her public life. But she began spending months at a time in the Salem house, working on what she began to call the archive. She converted the largest room in the house into a research center, filling it with filing cabinets and notebooks and index cards. She began cataloging every story, every voice, every piece of testimony she could gather about women trapped in houses, in marriages, in families, in systems that had been designed to contain them. She published a new book, The House as Character, Women's Stories of Domestic Imprisonment. It was not a commercial success, but it found its audience among academics and people who had experienced their own forms of containment. And slowly, people began to contact Eleanor, sending her their own stories, their own documentation of family horrors and hidden suffering. Eleanor became a repository, a collector of pain, a witness to trauma, and the houses, for she began to realize that there were many houses scattered across the country, seemed to recognize her. They began to reach out to her in subtle ways. A woman in Massachusetts would read one of Eleanor's books and suddenly remember that her grandmother had disappeared from an old house decades ago. A librarian in Pennsylvania would find a box of old letters in a donation and send them to Eleanor. knowing instinctively that she would understand their significance. A real estate agent in Florida would have a strange compulsion to contact Eleanor about a Victorian mansion that had a history of disappearances among its residents. The pattern became undeniable. The houses were guiding Eleanor to the stories. They were directing her toward the women who had been trapped, whose voices had been silenced, whose suffering had been preserved in walls and floorboards and foundation stones. And then, in her 70s, Eleanor had another experience that would shape the final chapter of her understanding. She was living in Boston, having stepped back from her active archival work due to her advancing age. She was working on her final book, a comprehensive history of women's domestic imprisonment across American history, told through the voices she'd collected over the decades. She was alone in her apartment on a winter evening when she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found a young woman standing in the hallway, soaking wet from snow, shivering from cold. She looked to be in her late 20s, and her face held an expression of desperate hope and profound despair. "Eleanor Hartwell?" the woman asked. "Yes." "My name is Maya. I don't know how to explain this. I read your books, all of them, and I think I'm supposed to find you. I think I'm supposed to tell you something." The woman's teeth were chattering. Eleanor immediately pulled her inside. After warming her up with hot tea and dry clothes, Maya told her story. She had been married to a man who kept her isolated in a large house in rural New York. He had prevented her from working, from seeing family, from accessing money or communication with the outside world. But then, unexpectedly, she had found Eleanor's books in a used bookstore. She had read them, and something in them had awakened her to her own situation. She had recognized herself in Eleanor's accounts. She had understood that what was happening to her was not love, but captivity. Using Eleanor's accounts as inspiration and courage, Maya had planned her escape. She had saved money secretly. She had established contact with her family. And finally, she had left. "I came here because I needed to tell you," Maya said, crying. "I needed you to know that your work, your documentation of all these stories, saved my life. Literally saved my life. If I hadn't read about what you experienced in those other houses, I wouldn't have recognized what was happening to me. I would still be there. I would be like Sarah Chen. I would have spent decades waiting for permission to die." Eleanor had held this young woman and felt something shift inside her. For so long, she had viewed her work as testimony, as preservation, as bearing witness. But it was more than that. It was also rescue. By telling the stories of women trapped in houses, by documenting their suffering and survival, she was sending messages to other women. Messages that said, "You are not alone. This is wrong. You can escape." The houses had been teaching Eleanor for decades, teaching her that her purpose was not just to remember but to warn, not just to archive but to illuminate, not just to preserve the past but to change the future. Eleanor worked obsessively after Maya's visit. She spent the last 5 years of her life compiling everything. All the journals, all the notes, all the stories, all the documentation. She created a massive database, organized in multiple ways so that women looking for their own stories would be able to find them. She wrote an introduction that was itself a roadmap, a guide for recognizing the signs of domestic imprisonment, for understanding the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that men controlled women through isolation. She published the final volume just 3 months before she died. It was called The Houses Remember, a complete archive of women's stories of domestic imprisonment in America. The book was 1,947 pages long. It contained 247 individual testimonies. It included photographs, documents, journal entries, and Eleanor's own scholarly analysis of the pattern she'd observed. It was both a devastating indictment of a system that had allowed women to be disappeared into homes and families, and a monument to the resilience of those women, those who had survived, those who had escaped, and those whose stories had been preserved only through the words they'd left behind in walls and journals and hidden spaces. Eleanor didn't live to see the book's success. She died on a cold morning in January, sitting in her apartment in Boston, reading through one final collection of letters that had arrived just weeks before. According to her doctor, it was a heart attack, quick and painless. According to the paramedics, she was found with a smile on her face. 15 years after Eleanor Hartwell's death, a young woman named Claire finds herself newly widowed and inheriting an old Victorian house in Portland, Oregon. She has no family to help her, no clear sense of direction, She feels lost, adrift, desperate for some kind of anchor to ground herself in a world that has suddenly become hostile and uncertain. When she enters the house, she smells the familiar scent, roses, decay, secrets. When she begins to explore, she finds the first note hidden in a crack in the parlor wall. The handwriting is careful, urgent, pleading. Someone has left a message for her. Someone who knows exactly what she needs to hear. She reads the note. Then she searches for more. Over the course of a week, she finds dozens of them. Each one a piece of a puzzle, each one a voice reaching out across decades. Among them, she finds a note that seems different from the others. It's written on paper that looks newer, and the handwriting is unmistakably contemporary. The date is from just 5 years ago, 2034. My name is Maya. I found Eleanor Hartwell's books when I was trapped. Those books saved my life, and now I'm leaving these words for the next woman who needs saving. If you're reading this, you're probably confused. You're probably scared. You might feel like you're going crazy, but you're not. The house is real. The other women are real, and you have a choice that so many others never had. You can listen to their stories, learn from their experiences, and use that knowledge to save yourself. Eleanor Hartwell is gone, but her work remains. Her archive remains, and it's waiting for you. Find it, read it, use it, and if you survive, when you survive, consider adding your own story to the collection. Become a link in a chain that will eventually reach another woman, another victim, another prisoner. Because that's what this is, ultimately. It's a chain, a network, a web of women reaching across time to help each other survive. Welcome to the house. Welcome to our sisterhood of survivors. Below Maya's note, someone else has written more recently. I read your note. I'm reading Eleanor's books. I think I understand now. I think I'm ready to plan my escape. Thank you for leaving this here. Thank you for believing I would find it. I'm not alone. I was never alone. This is my note to the next woman. You are not crazy. You are not weak. You are not deserving of the cage you're in. The house knows this. The walls know this. And we, all of us who came before, we know this too. There is a way out. Hold on to that truth. Claire reads these notes and feels something break open inside her. She doesn't know yet if she's trapped. She doesn't know yet if she needs to escape. But she knows that she's not alone. She knows that her experience, whatever it might be, has been lived before. That her suffering, if it comes, will not be meaningless. That there is a network of women reaching across time, generation to generation, trying to save each other. She finds Eleanor's archive on the internet. It's been maintained by volunteers, kept alive in a dozen different formats to ensure it can never be lost or destroyed. She begins reading. She reads the stories of Catherine Ashford and her sisters. She reads the testimony of Sarah Chen. She reads the accounts of hundreds of women whose names and faces have been preserved only through Eleanor Hartwell's determination to witness and document. And as she reads, Claire begins to understand something profound. The houses themselves might be prisons, but they are also libraries. They are repositories of truth. They hold the stories that society wants to forget. They bear witness to suffering that the world would prefer to ignore. The houses, in their own terrible way, are also instruments of resistance. They preserve the voices of the silenced. They keep the stories alive. They ensure that no woman's suffering is entirely erased. And Eleanor Hartwell, a widow who once came to a house seeking shelter and found instead a calling, had understood this better than anyone. She had made herself a vessel for these stories. She had become the bridge between the past and the future. She had ensured that the next woman who entered a house with a hidden history would not have to decode her imprisonment alone. The cycle continues. The houses continue to speak. The women continue to leave notes in the walls. And somewhere, in an apartment in Boston, or a house in Salem, or any of 100 locations across the country, another woman is reading Eleanor Hartwell's words and understanding that her experience, whatever it might be, is not isolated. It is part of a pattern, part of a history, part of a vast and terrible and beautiful network of women reaching out to each other across time and space and circumstance. The house that Claire now inhabits, the house that has chosen her, is just another link in this chain. Another voice in a chorus that will never be silenced. Another space where women's experiences will be preserved and protected and eventually, hopefully, liberated. And if Claire survives, if she escapes or transcends or transforms what is happening to her, she too will become part of Eleanor's legacy. She will leave her own notes in the walls. She will add her voice to the archive. She will become a messenger, a witness, A guardian of truth in a world that would prefer all these stories remain hidden. The loop closes. The loop opens. The cycle repeats. And in the spaces between the walls, in the cracks and crevices of old houses scattered across a nation, the voices of thousands of women, all of them trapped, all of them suffering, all of them reaching out, continue to speak. They speak to each other. They speak to Eleanor wherever she has gone. They speak to Claire and to every woman who will come after. And the message is always the same: you are not alone. The walls remember. The house knows. And we are waiting to help you find your way home.